All right, so we're diving deep today into 2 Corinthians 8, 1-5.
Okay.
And, most pastors are probably thinking, not this passage again. But this is going to be different because we've actually analyzed sermons and commentaries from 9 different churches. And it's fascinating to see how different pastors are approaching this passage in some really unique ways.
Yeah, it's funny how this one little passage, 2 Corinthians 8, 1 to 5, you think you heard it all.
Right.
But, there are always new insights and fresh angles to uncover. It never gets old.
No, it really doesn't.
Yeah.
Like, we all know the basic story, right? The Macedonian church is super poor, but
Yeah.
incredibly generous.
Right.
But one of the sermons we looked at from Limitless Life TV, they had this really cool concept. They called it the bag mindset versus the barn mindset.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
And it really got me thinking because the bag mindset is all about holding on tight to what you have.
Yeah.
Scarcity fear.
Right. It's that I don't have enough mentality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the barn mindset, that's all about abundance. It's about trusting that the more you give, the more God will provide.
It's like that saying, you can't outgive God.
I love that. And it's so true. The Macedonians, they weren't giving out of their surplus. They were giving out of their need. That's some serious faith right there.
Absolutely. It really challenges our assumptions about what it means to be generous.
And it makes you wonder what would happen if we as pastors really encouraged our congregations to adopt that same barn mindset.
That's a powerful question. And it gets to the heart of what Paul was trying to convey in this passage. He wasn't just commending the Macedonians for their generosity. He was holding them up as an example for the Corinthians and for us today.
Exactly. It's like a blueprint for how we should be living our lives as followers of Christ.
And that's where the concept of grace-based giving comes in. Several of the churches we looked at, like Vine Church and Prestonwood Baptist Church, really emphasized this connection.
Yeah, they were saying that true generosity flows from a heart that's been transformed by God's grace.
Exactly. Vine Church actually described grace as God's riches at Christ's expense.
Wow, that's good.
When we truly grasp the enormity of that gift-giving becomes less about obligation and more about a joyful response to God's overwhelming generosity.
It's like that quote from Al Mohler that they shared at Prestonwood. Jesus traded his royal robes for a servant's towel.
Powerful imagery right there.
Talk about sacrificial giving. It completely reframes our perspective.
It does. And it reminds us that we can't outgive God. The more we give, the more we open ourselves up to experiencing his abundance in our own lives.
That's so true. And it's not just about the dollar amount either. Several sermons highlighted the story of the widow's mite, emphasizing that God values the heart behind the gift more than the amount itself.
Yeah, Church 80 even connected this to the seed, time, and harvest principle.
Wow.
What we sow generously, we reap. It's about investing in God's kingdom, trusting that he will multiply our efforts.
So it's not just about giving money. It's about giving our time, our talents, our energy, everything we have.
Exactly. It's about a complete surrender to God's will.
It's amazing how these different churches use the same passage to address such a variety of issues. Like Shelby Christian and Missionary Alliance actually use this Instagram account called Preacher Sneakers as a cautionary tale.
Preacher sneakers? I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, it's this page that calls out pastors who are sporting ridiculously expensive designer sneakers, often bought with church funds.
Oh.
And they use it to spark a conversation about misplaced priorities and the importance of financial responsibility as leaders.
That's certainly a unique approach.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's effective. It gets people thinking about where their priorities lie, not just in terms of finances, but in all areas of life.
Right. It's a good reminder that our actions speak louder than our words.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenging assumptions, I was really struck by Mercy Hill Church's sermon illustration. They shared this story about a little boy who stepped right into the offering plate during a service.
Oh, I love that story.
He wanted to give everything, not just his money, but himself.
What a beautiful picture of childlike faith.
Isn't it? It's a powerful image of complete surrender.
It really is. It reminds us that true generosity goes beyond the financial. It's about giving our whole selves to God.
Okay, so we've talked about the Macedonian paradox, grace-based, giving the importance of the heart behind the gift. But one thing that really stood out to me was how many churches tied this passage to the historical context.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that these churches, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, they weren't just facing financial hardship, they were also dealing with intense persecution for their faith.
And yet, they were still incredibly generous. Like Schweitzer Church even pointed out that Philippi was named after Alexander the Great's father, Philip, which adds a whole other layer to the story. This was a region steeped in conflict and turmoil, and yet these believers chose to prioritize giving. It makes their generosity even more remarkable.
It really does. And it challenges us to think about how we respond to hardship in our own lives. Do we retreat into ourselves, focusing on our own needs and anxieties? Or do we, like the Macedonians, choose to trust God and extend generosity to others even when it seems impossible?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another crucial point that several of the sermons touched upon the motivation behind our giving.
Right, it's not enough to just go through the motions. True generosity flows from a heart transformed by God's grace.
And that transformation leads to a joy in giving that can't be replicated by any other means.
It's a joy that comes from knowing that we are participating in God's work in the world.
And that's something that I think we can all get excited about.
Absolutely. You know, it's funny how we always talk about giving as a response to God's grace,
Mm.
but it's really more than that.
Yeah.
Giving is a reflection of that grace.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Like holding up a mirror to that generosity that God's shown to us.
Exactly. And several sermons really hit on that.
Yeah, like Vine Church, when they talk about grace as God's riches at Christ's expense, it kind of changes the whole way you look at it.
It does. It shifts it from what we're giving up to what we've already been given.
Right. And Prestonwood, they had a similar idea with their message on grace-based giving.
Yeah.
Like saying the act of giving is an extension of God's grace.
Like we can't outgive God.
I love that.
Yeah.
The more we give, the more we experience God's abundance. But it's not just about getting blessings back.
Right. It's about reflecting God's character.
That brings up a question that a lot of the sermons touched on. How do we measure generosity? Is it about the dollar amount or is it something more?
Well, we talk about the widow's mite,
Right.
which shows God cares more about the heart than the size of the offering.
Yeah.
And AHOP Church TV had a cool analogy. They talked about generosity as a heart test, like a litmus test in science.
Oh, okay.
So just like a litmus test shows the pH,
Uh-huh.
giving shows what our heart's really like.
So are we giving out of love and gratitude or out of guilt and obligation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes you think about why you're giving.
Yeah. Speaking of transformation, I want to go back to something you mentioned before. How do we as pastors create a culture of generosity in our churches?
It's not easy.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Especially when the world's telling people to be selfish.
It's like swimming upstream.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we break through that and inspire people to give generously, joyfully, and sacrificially?
Well, I think it starts with us leading by example.
Yeah, we got to be the first ones to show that kind of generosity.
Not just money, but our time, talents, energy.
And also being honest about our own struggles with giving.
Because let's face it, none of us are perfect.
Nope. We all have those selfish
And
goals.
when open about it can make people feel safe to talk about their own giving.
And we could all help each other grow.
Another thing that stood out was how many churches talked about teaching about generosity.
Yeah, it's not enough to just preach about it once a year.
Right. We got to weave it into everything we do.
To how it connects to our whole faith.
Our relationship with God, with each other.
And give people practical tools.
Like budgeting guides, workshops, service opportunities.
So they can experience the joy of giving firsthand.
Exactly. And speaking of joy, I think that's a big part of it. Moving away from guilt trips and focusing on the good that comes from giving freely.
Like those Macedonian churches, finding joy even when they didn't have much.
Because they knew their giving was making a difference.
That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Using what we have to build God's kingdom.
And when we do that, we see that it truly is more blessed to give than to receive.
So as we finish this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I want you to think about this. How can you model radical generosity?
In your own life.
What can you do to help your congregation give more freely and joyfully?
And how can you shift the focus from obligation to joy?
You know what's funny? As we've been talking about 2 Corinthians 8, 1-5, it's easy to get stuck on just the money part of it.
Yeah, like money's the only way to be generous.
Right. But a lot of the churches we looked at went way beyond that.
Definitely. Like generosity is about way more than your wallet.
Exactly. It's about your whole life.
Shelby Christian and Missionary Alliance had this really interesting idea.
Okay.
They called it voluntary sacrificial giving.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And they were saying it's not just like, here's my 10% God, now give me blessings. It's something deeper.
Yeah.
It takes real faith to give sacrificially, when it means giving more than you're comfortable with.
Like those Macedonians did.
Exactly. And that's where the true joy of giving comes in. You know, letting go and trusting God.
It's like that story from Mercy Hill, the little boy stepping right into the offering plate.
Oh, yeah. Powerful image.
He wanted to give everything, not just his money, but himself.
Total surrender.
It shows that generosity isn't just checking a box. It's about giving your whole heart to God's work.
Absolutely. So if we're trying to help people think about generosity in a new way,
Yeah.
what are the big takeaways from all this?
Well, first, generosity isn't just about money. It's about giving our time, talents, energy, our whole selves to God.
Right. And it's not about guilt or obligation. It's about responding to God's grace with joy.
And it takes a change in mindset from scarcity to abundance,
Hmm.
trusting that God will provide even when we give sacrificially.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just about individual acts of giving. It's about creating a culture of generosity in our churches.
Where giving becomes a natural part of who we are.
Remember those Macedonian churches? Their generosity didn't come from wealth. It came from their faith and their commitment to God.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, think about this. How can you be radically generous?
In your own life.
How can you inspire your congregation to give freely and joyfully?
And how can you help people see that giving is a blessing, not a burden?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into 2 Corinthians 8, 1-5. We hope it's given you some new ideas and a fresh passion for generosity in your ministry.